On May 31st, 1984, at 10:47 p.m., 6 condemned men walked out of Virginia's maximum security Mecklenburg Correctional Center as free men. What they accomplished that night would go down as the largest death row escape in United States history. But freedom would be fleeting, and their ultimate fate would remain unchanged. These weren't ordinary criminals. Each of the 6 men had been sentenced to die for brutal murders that had terrorized Virginia communities. Together, they had killed more than a dozen innocent people. Their names were Linwood Earl Briley, James Dyrrell Briley, Earl Clanton Jr., Derek Lynn Peterson, Willie Leroy Jones, and Lem Davis Tuggle Jr. Their escape was audacious, methodical, and ultimately futile. Within 3 weeks, all 6 would be back in custody. Over the next 12 years, each would walk to his execution, their desperate bid for freedom serving only to delay the inevitable. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you never miss a video. And let's get into it. Linwood Earl Briley, Virginia. On March 5th, 1979, 30-year-old disc jockey John Gallagher was kidnapped from a Richmond street, robbed, and shot to death. The man responsible was 25-year-old Linwood Earl Briley, the older of 2 brothers whose crime spree had terrorized the Richmond area. Linwood Briley didn't work alone. Along with his younger brother James and other accomplices, he had embarked on what authorities called a reign of terror across Richmond. The Briley gang's crimes weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated, brutal, and showed a complete disregard for human life. Gallagher, known to his radio audience as Johnny G, had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The investigation into Gallagher's murder revealed the extent of the Briley brothers' criminal enterprise. They had been responsible for multiple robberies, sexual assaults, and murders throughout the Richmond area. Witnesses described the brothers as cold-blooded killers who seemed to enjoy inflicting terror on their victims. At trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence linking Linwood Briley to Gallagher's murder. The jury heard testimony about the systematic nature of the Briley gang's crimes and the calculated way they had stalked their victims. Briley's defense team argued for life in prison, citing his troubled childhood and history of substance abuse. The jury wasn't swayed. After deliberating, they sentenced Linwood Briley to death. During his time on death row at Mecklenburg Correctional Center, Briley maintained his innocence while preparing for what would become the most infamous escape in death row history. He spent over 4 years awaiting execution, during which time he and 5 fellow inmates would plan their daring breakout. For his last meal, Briley requested steak, baked potato, green peas, salad, apple pie, and milk. On October 12, 1984, just 4 months after his escape and recapture, Linwood Earl Briley was executed by electric chair at Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond. When asked for final words, Briley maintained the same claim he had made throughout his imprisonment: "I am innocent." At 30 years old, he became the first of the Mecklenburg Six to pay the ultimate price for his crimes. James Dyrrell Briley, Virginia. James Briley's path to death row began on October 5, 1979, when he committed one of the most heinous crimes in Richmond's history. His victims were Harvey Wilkerson, Judy Barton, who was 8 months pregnant, and Judy's 5-year-old son, Harvey Wayne Barton. The 24-year-old James Briley had broken into the family's home during what was supposed to be a routine robbery. When the family resisted, Briley's violence escalated beyond anything investigators had seen. He killed all 3 family members, including the unborn child, showing the same callous disregard for life that characterized the Briley gang's crimes. The murders sent shockwaves through Richmond's community. The idea that a pregnant woman and small child could be gunned down in their own home during a robbery gone wrong horrified residents and put enormous pressure on police to solve the case quickly. James Briley was arrested along with his brother Linwood as part of the broader investigation into the Briley gang's activities. At trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a young man who had chosen violence over any other option when confronted with resistance during his crimes. The evidence against James was overwhelming, including ballistics evidence linking him to the murder weapon. His defense attorneys argued that James had been influenced by his older brother Linwood and hadn't been the mastermind of the gang's activities. They pleaded for life in prison, noting his youth and the possibility of rehabilitation. The jury rejected these arguments, finding that the brutality of the crimes, particularly the murder of a pregnant woman and child, warranted the death penalty. James Briley spent over 5 years on death row, during which time he participated in the May 1984 escape alongside his brother and 4 other condemned inmates. After his recapture, he faced the reality that his bid for freedom had only delayed his execution. For his last meal, James Briley requested fried shrimp. No final statement was recorded when he was executed by electric chair at Virginia State Penitentiary on April 18, 1985. He was 28 years old, becoming the second member of the Mecklenburg Six to be executed. Earl Clanton, Jr., Virginia. On November 16, 1980, 33-year-old Earl Clanton, Jr. walked into the Petersburg Public Library with robbery on his mind. Behind the circulation desk was 55-year-old librarian Wilhelmina Smith, working alone during the evening hours. What began as a simple robbery would escalate into one of the most brutal crimes in Petersburg's history. Clanton had been struggling financially and saw the library as an easy target for quick cash. When he confronted Smith and demanded money, the librarian initially cooperated, opening the cash drawer and handing over what little money the library kept on hand. But Clanton's violence didn't end with the robbery. Rather than simply taking the money and leaving, Clanton attacked Smith with savage brutality. He strangled the librarian with his bare hands, then stabbed her multiple times to ensure she was dead. Smith's body was discovered the next morning by library staff arriving for work, sending shockwaves through the quiet Petersburg community. The investigation moved quickly. Clanton had left behind physical evidence linking him to the crime, and witnesses had seen him near the library around the time of the murder. When police arrested him, Clanton initially denied involvement, but eventually confessed to both the robbery and murder. At trial, prosecutors presented a clear case of robbery gone wrong, escalated by Clanton's decision to eliminate the only witness to his crime. His defense team argued that Clanton hadn't planned to kill Smith, suggesting the murder was an impulsive act during a robbery that had spiraled out of control. They pleaded for life in prison, emphasizing that Clanton had no prior history of violent crime. The jury wasn't persuaded by the defense arguments. They convicted Clanton of capital murder and sentenced him to death on May 1, 1981. His appeals were systematically denied by both state and federal courts. Clanton spent over 6 years on death row at Mecklenburg Correctional Center, during which time he participated in the infamous May 1984 escape. After his recapture, he exhausted his remaining appeals and faced the reality of his approaching execution date. No record exists of Clanton's last meal request. Governor Gerald Balilas denied his clemency petition just 1 hour before his scheduled execution. On April 14, 1988, Earl Clanton, Jr. was executed by electric chair at Virginia State Penitentiary. No final words were recorded. He was 33 years old, becoming the third member of the Mecklenburg Six to be executed. Derek Lynn Peterson, Virginia. On February 7, 1982, 22-year-old Derek Lynn Peterson walked into a Hampton grocery store with a gun and desperation. Behind the counter was 58-year-old Howard Kaufman, the store manager who had worked at the location for over a decade. Peterson's need for quick cash would cost Kaufman his life. Peterson had been struggling with drug addiction and mounting debts when he decided to rob the grocery store. He had cased the location and knew that Kaufman often worked alone during evening hours, making him an easy target. What Peterson hadn't anticipated was that Kaufman would resist the robbery attempt. When Peterson entered the store and demanded money from the register, Kaufman initially complied, opening the cash drawer and beginning to hand over the day's receipts. But when the store manager hesitated or made a movement Peterson interpreted as threatening, the young robber pulled the trigger. Kaufman was shot once in the chest and died almost instantly. Peterson fled the store with less than $200 in cash, leaving behind physical evidence that would quickly lead police to his door. The murder weapon was recovered, and ballistics testing confirmed it was the gun used to kill Kaufman. Witness testimony placed Peterson in the area around the time of the murder. His trial began in August 1982, with prosecutors arguing that Peterson had committed premeditated murder during the commission of an armed robbery. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including the recovered murder weapon and eyewitness identification. Peterson's defense team argued that the shooting was unintentional, claiming their client had only meant to rob the store and the gun had discharged accidentally during a struggle. The jury rejected the defense's arguments and convicted Peterson of capital murder. On August 30th, 1982, they sentenced him to death. His state and federal appeals failed to overturn the conviction or sentence. Peterson spent over 8 years on death row, during which time noted civil rights attorney Julius Chambers filed a clemency petition on his behalf to Governor L. Douglas Wilder. The petition was denied, and Peterson's participation in the Mecklenburg escape had not helped his cause. No record exists of Peterson's last meal request. When he was executed by electric chair at Greensville Correctional Center on August 22, 1991, Peterson used his final statement to blame racism for his fate, delivering lengthy remarks that accused the justice system of bias. He was 30 years old, becoming the fourth member of the Mecklenburg Six to be executed. His electrocution led to procedural changes requiring 2 shock cycles to ensure death. Willie Leroy Jones, Virginia. On May 13, 1983, 34-year-old Willie Leroy Jones broke into the rural home of an elderly couple with robbery on his mind. His victims were Graham and Myra Adkins, ages 79 and 76 respectively, who lived alone on their farm outside Richmond. Jones's decision to target the vulnerable couple would lead to one of the most disturbing crimes in Virginia's recent history. Jones had been casing homes in the rural area, looking for easy targets with cash or valuables. The Adkins farm seemed perfect, an isolated location with elderly occupants who wouldn't be able to put up much resistance. Jones broke into their home during the evening hours when the couple was preparing for bed. What began as a robbery quickly escalated into murder. Jones killed both Graham and Myra Adkins during the commission of the burglary, shooting them both before ransacking their home for money and valuables. But Jones's violence didn't end with the murders. In an attempt to cover his tracks and destroy evidence, he set the Adkins home on fire with the bodies still inside. The fire was discovered by neighbors who saw the flames and called the fire department. When firefighters arrived and extinguished the blaze, they discovered the burned remains of the elderly couple. The medical examiner determined both had been shot before the fire started, confirming this was a double homicide rather than an accidental fire. The investigation focused on recent parolees and known burglars in the area. Jones's criminal history and proximity to the crime scene made him a person of interest. Physical evidence from the scene, including fingerprints and ballistics evidence, linked Jones to the murders. At trial in January 1984, prosecutors presented evidence of Jones's systematic planning and the cold-blooded nature of the crimes. The jury heard testimony about how Jones had specifically targeted the elderly couple because of their vulnerability. His defense team argued for life in prison, citing Jones's troubled background and history of substance abuse. The jury sentenced Jones to death, finding that the murders were especially heinous and committed during the commission of multiple felonies. The Supreme Court denied his final appeal on September 15, 1992, and his clemency petition was also denied. No record exists of Jones's last meal request. On September 11, 1992, Willie Leroy Jones was executed by electric chair at Greensville Correctional Center. His final words included, "I love you," directed toward family members who witnessed his execution. He was 34 years old, becoming the fifth member of the Mecklenburg Six to be executed. Lem Davis Tuggle, Jr., Virginia. On a summer evening in 1983, 44-year-old Lem Davis Tuggle, Jr. drove through the rural mountains of Smythe County, Virginia, searching for a victim. His target would be 52-year-old Jessie Geneva Havens, a local woman who made the fatal mistake of accepting a ride from a stranger. Tuggle had been drinking heavily and prowling the back roads when he encountered Havens, who was walking alone after her car had broken down. He offered her a ride, and she gratefully accepted, having no way of knowing she was climbing into a vehicle with a predator. Tuggle drove her to an isolated area where he raped and murdered her, shooting her multiple times before abandoning her body. The crime sent shockwaves through the tight-knit rural community. Jessie Havens had been a well-known local woman with family and friends who immediately noticed her disappearance. When her body was discovered days later, the brutality of the crime horrified investigators and residents alike. The investigation quickly focused on Tuggle, whose vehicle had been seen in the area around the time of Havens's disappearance. Physical evidence from the crime scene, including DNA evidence and ballistics testing, linked him conclusively to both the rape and murder. When confronted with the evidence, Tuggle initially denied involvement, but eventually confessed to the crimes. His trial began in 1984, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence of Tuggle's guilt. The jury heard testimony about the systematic way Tuggle had stalked his victim and the brutal nature of the sexual assault and murder. Tuggle's defense team, which would later include future Virginia Governor Tim Kaine on appeal, argued for life in prison, citing their client's history of alcohol abuse and mental health issues. The jury rejected the defense arguments and sentenced Tuggle to death. His case would wind through the appeals process for over a decade, with multiple stays of execution as his attorneys fought to overturn the conviction or sentence. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and ultimately the Supreme Court, upheld both his conviction and death sentence. Tuggle spent over 12 years on death row, longer than any of his fellow Mecklenburg escapees. During this time, he participated in the infamous 1984 escape and was recaptured along with the others. His lengthy appeals process meant he would be the last of the six to face execution. No record exists of Tuggle's last meal request. On December 12, 1996, Lem Davis Tuggle, Jr. was executed by lethal injection at Greensville Correctional Center. His final statement included a Christmas message, as his execution took place just 2 weeks before the holiday. He was 44 years old, becoming the last member of the Mecklenburg Six to be executed and closing a chapter that had begun with their daring escape 12 years earlier. The plan had been months in the making. By the spring of 1984, the 6 condemned men housed on death row at Mecklenburg Correctional Center had developed an elaborate scheme to escape their fate. Linwood Briley, the oldest and most experienced criminal among them, had emerged as the ringleader of what would become the largest death row escape in American history. Mecklenburg Correctional Center was supposed to be escape-proof. The maximum security facility housed Virginia's most dangerous criminals, including all of the state's death row inmates. But the 6 men had identified a critical weakness in the prison's security protocols, the procedures for transferring inmates and processing deliveries at the main gate. On the evening of May 31, 1984, at approximately 10:47 p.m., the plan went into motion. The 6 inmates had fashioned fake uniforms and constructed what appeared to be an explosive device using soap, a battery, and wiring. Armed with these props and their detailed knowledge of the prison's routines, they set out to bluff their way to freedom. The escape began when the 6 men overpowered guards in their housing unit, taking 12 correctional officers hostage in the process. Remarkably, despite the violence of their original crimes, No prison staff members were seriously injured during the escape. The inmates had apparently decided that killing guards would only bring more heat and make their eventual recapture more likely to result in additional death sentences. Using the stolen uniforms and fake explosive device, the escapees convinced other guards that they were conducting an authorized transfer of a dangerous inmate. They loaded into a prison van and drove toward the main gate, where their elaborate deception would face its ultimate test. The guards at the gate, following standard protocol, accepted the fake paperwork and authorized identification presented by the escapees. The van carrying 6 of Virginia's most dangerous criminals simply drove out of the maximum security facility and into the night, beginning what would become a 3-week manhunt across multiple states. Within hours of the escape, law enforcement agencies across Virginia and neighboring states had been alerted. The FBI joined the search, recognizing that the escapees posed an extreme danger to public safety. Photos and descriptions of all 6 men were distributed to police departments, airports, bus stations, and border crossings. The escape exposed serious flaws in Mecklenburg's security procedures and raised questions about how 6 death row inmates had been able to walk out of a maximum security prison. Prison officials launched an immediate investigation into the security breach, while politicians demanded answers about how such a failure could have occurred. Now, the escapees had a significant head start, but they also faced enormous challenges. 6 men traveling together would be conspicuous, especially when their faces were plastered across television screens and newspaper front pages throughout the region. They had no long-term plan beyond getting out of prison, no safe houses arranged, and limited resources for sustaining themselves on the run. The first break in the case came quickly. Just hours after the escape, Earl Clanton Jr. and Derek Lynn Peterson made a critical mistake. Instead of splitting up or heading for major cities where they could blend in, they traveled together to Warrenton, North Carolina, a small town where strangers would be easily noticed. On June 1, 1984, less than 24 hours after their escape, Clanton and Peterson were spotted by local residents who recognized them from news reports. Police surrounded their location and arrested both men without incident. The 30-year-old Clanton and 22-year-old Peterson had managed just 1 day of freedom before their capture. Their quick arrest provided investigators with valuable intelligence about the escape and the possible whereabouts of the remaining 4 fugitives. But it also meant that 4 extremely dangerous men were still at large, including the Briley brothers, who were considered the most violent and unpredictable of the group. The manhunt intensified as federal authorities coordinated with police departments across the eastern United States. The escapees' photos were distributed to hotels, bus stations, airports, and truck stops. Tips poured in from across the country, but most led nowhere as the remaining fugitives seemed to have vanished. Meanwhile, Lem Tuggle Jr. and Willie Leroy Jones had made it much further than their captured associates. The 2 men had somehow managed to travel over 500 miles north, making it all the way to Vermont before their luck ran out. They had been living rough, sleeping in cars and wooded areas while trying to figure out their next move. On June 8th and 9th, 1984, exactly 1 week after Clanton and Peterson's capture, police in Vermont set up roadblocks as part of the ongoing search. When Tuggle and Jones were spotted at one of these checkpoints, they realized their run was over. Rather than risk a violent confrontation that might result in their deaths or the deaths of innocent officers, both men surrendered peacefully. The capture of Tuggle and Jones left only the Briley brothers still at large. Linwood and James Briley had proven to be the most resourceful of the escapees, managing to evade capture for nearly 3 weeks. They had made it to Philadelphia, where they attempted to blend in with the urban population while planning their next move. But the brothers' freedom was also coming to an end. On June 19th and 20th, 1984, Philadelphia police, acting on tips from local residents, arrested both Briley brothers. The arrest was dramatic, with both men initially held on $10 million bond each, as authorities prepared to transport them back to Virginia. The capture of Linwood and James Briley marked the end of the manhunt. All 6 escapees were back in custody after 19 days of freedom, during which they had managed to travel across multiple states, but had ultimately found no safe haven from the justice system. They had tried to escape. The Mecklenburg escape sent shockwaves through Virginia's corrections system and prompted immediate reforms to prevent similar incidents. Prison officials conducted a comprehensive review of security procedures, focusing particularly on the gate protocols that had allowed 6 death row inmates to simply drive out of a maximum security facility. The escape had been an embarrassment for Virginia corrections and had raised serious questions about the competency of prison management. How had 6 of the state's most dangerous criminals been able to overpower guards, steal uniforms, and convince gate security that they were conducting an authorized transfer? The investigation revealed multiple failures in communication and protocol that had made the escape possible. One of the most significant changes implemented in response to the escape was enhanced communication between different areas of the prison. The guards at the gate would no longer simply accept paperwork and uniforms as authorization for inmate transfers. New procedures required multiple levels of verification and direct communication with supervisors before any inmate movement could be authorized. The state also invested in upgraded security technology, including better surveillance systems and communication equipment. The goal was to ensure that any future escape attempt would be detected and stopped before inmates could reach the prison's perimeter. But perhaps the most dramatic change came in 1991, when Virginia moved its execution chamber from the old Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond to the newer Greensville Correctional Center. This move was partly motivated by security concerns raised by the Mecklenburg escape, as officials wanted to consolidate death row operations at a more secure facility. The escape had also highlighted the extreme security risks posed by housing multiple death row inmates in the same facility. Later reforms would eventually lead to the relocation of male death row inmates to Sussex I State Prison in 1998, further dispersing the state's most dangerous criminals. For the 6 escapees themselves, their brief taste of freedom had accomplished nothing except to generate additional security measures that would make future escapes nearly impossible. They returned to death row to face the same fate they had tried to escape, with the added knowledge that their desperate gamble had failed completely. The manhunt had cost Virginia taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars and had required the coordination of law enforcement agencies across multiple states. The escapees had terrorized communities along their route and had forced thousands of officers to work around the clock to recapture them. Most importantly, the escape had reminded the public of the extreme danger posed by the men on death row. These weren't simply criminals who had made mistakes. They were individuals who had committed the most heinous crimes imaginable and had shown they were willing to use violence to avoid facing the consequences of their actions. The execution of Lem Davis Tuggle Jr. on December 12, 1996, marked the end of a 12-year saga that had begun with 6 desperate men walking out of a maximum security prison. Over those 12 years, each member of the Mecklenburg Six had taken his final walk to the execution chamber, their brief escape serving only to delay their inevitable fate. The timing of their executions reflected the methodical pace of Virginia's death penalty system. Linwood Briley, as the apparent ringleader, was executed first, just 4 months after his recapture. His brother James followed 6 months later. The remaining 4 men lived on borrowed time for years longer, their appeals working their way through state and federal courts, while they remained locked in cells designed to prevent any future escape attempts. The methods of execution also told a story of changing times. 5 of the 6 men died in Virginia's electric chair, a method that had been used in the state since 1908. But by the time Tuggle faced his execution in 1996, Virginia had adopted lethal injection as its primary method of execution, making him the only member of the group to die by injection rather than electrocution. The governors who presided over these executions represented different political parties and philosophies, but none granted clemency to any member of the Mecklenburg Six. Charles Robb oversaw the Briley brothers' executions in 1984 and 85. Gerald Baliles denied Earl Clanton's clemency petition in 1988. Douglas Wilder refused to commute Derek Peterson's and Willie Jones's sentences in 1991 and 92. Finally, George Allen allowed Tuggle's execution to proceed in 1996. The consistent refusal to grant clemency reflected both the heinous nature of the original crimes and the public's reaction to the escape itself. The six men had not only committed brutal murders, but had also embarrassed the state's correction system and terrorized communities during their 3 weeks of freedom. Public sympathy for their fate was virtually non-existent. The Mecklenburg escape left a lasting impact on corrections systems far beyond Virginia. The detailed analysis of how 6 death row inmates had managed to walk out of a maximum security prison became required reading for corrections officials nationwide. Other states examined their own security protocols and made changes to prevent similar incidents. The most visible change was the physical relocation of Virginia's death row operations. The move from Mecklenburg to Greensville in 1991 and later to Sussex State Prison in 1998 reflected a new understanding that the most dangerous criminals required the highest levels of security. The old model of housing all death row inmates in one location had proven vulnerable to exactly the kind of coordinated escape the 6 men had executed. Communication protocols within prisons were revolutionized. The simple fact that gate guards had accepted fake paperwork and uniforms as authorization for an inmate transfer led to multiple layers of verification being required for any prisoner movement. No longer could a handful of inmates with stolen uniforms and forged documents simply drive out of a maximum security facility. The escape also highlighted the importance of intelligence gathering within prisons. The 6 men had spent months planning their escape, yet prison officials had no advance warning of their intentions. New procedures emphasized the need for correctional officers to monitor inmate communications and behavior for signs of escape planning. Technology played an increasingly important role in the reforms. Upgraded surveillance systems, better communication equipment, and electronic monitoring devices all became standard features at high-security facilities. The goal was to ensure that any future escape attempt would be detected and stopped long before inmates could reach the prison's perimeter. But perhaps most importantly, the Mecklenburg escape reinforced the public's understanding of why some criminals are sentenced to death in the first place. The 6 men hadn't simply committed crimes and accepted their punishment. They had used violence and deception to try to avoid facing the consequences of their actions, putting correctional officers and innocent civilians at risk in the process. The Mecklenburg Six escape stands as the largest death row breakout in United States history, a record that is unlikely to ever be broken given the security improvements implemented in its aftermath. The 19-day manhunt captured national attention and highlighted both the dangers posed by death row inmates and the challenges facing law enforcement in recapturing them. The case also demonstrated the ultimate futility of trying to escape the death penalty through violence. Despite their elaborate planning and temporary success, all 6 men eventually faced execution. Their escape had accomplished nothing except to delay their deaths and improve security for future death row inmates. The extensive media coverage of both the escape and the subsequent executions helped shape public opinion about the death penalty during a crucial period in its modern history. The fact that such dangerous criminals had tried to escape justice reinforced support for capital punishment among many Americans who might otherwise have had doubts about its necessity. For corrections professionals, the Mecklenburg escape became a case study in security failure and reform. The detailed analysis of what went wrong and how it was fixed has influenced prison design and operations for decades. Every major prison constructed since 1984 has incorporated lessons learned from the Mecklenburg incident. The case also highlighted the human cost of violent crime. The victims of the Mecklenburg Six, VI, from John Gallagher to Jesse Havens, were ordinary people whose lives were cut short by men who showed no regard for human life. Their families had to endure not only the original trauma of murder, but also the additional stress of knowing their loved ones' killers had temporarily escaped justice. In the end, the Mecklenburg Six case reinforced a fundamental principle of the American justice system, that no crime is so carefully planned, no criminal so clever, and no escape so elaborate that justice can be permanently avoided. The six men had their brief moment of freedom, but justice, though delayed, was not denied. The story of the Mecklenburg Six serves as both a cautionary tale about prison security and a reminder of why society reserves its ultimate punishment for its most dangerous criminals. Their escape and recapture demonstrated that while the machinery of justice may sometimes falter, it ultimately prevails. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and share it. Subscribe for more in-depth coverage of death penalty cases and criminal justice issues. The desperation that drives someone to escape the ultimate punishment reveals the powerful human instinct for survival, even in the most dire circumstances. But what happens when that same desperation manifests not on death row, but within the concrete walls of maximum security? The psychological pressure, the meticulous planning, the split-second decisions, these elements create a chilling parallel between those fleeing execution and those attempting the seemingly impossible, a prison break. Speaking of impossible escapes, there's one case we covered previously that demonstrates just how far some will go when freedom becomes their only obsession. A story that shocked the entire nation and redefined prison security forever.
What happens when the nation's most secure facilities fail to hold its most dangerous inmates? From daring tunnel digs to corrupt guards aiding getaways, these prison escapes shock the U.S. and expose deep cracks in the correctional system. Today, we dive into the most infamous prison breaks in American history, the masterminds behind them, how they pulled it off, and the massive manhunts that followed. Stay tuned. Richard Lee McNair, the man who mailed himself out of prison. State of crime, Louisiana. Age at time of escape, 47. On April 5, 2006, Richard Lee McNair, a convicted murderer serving a life sentence, orchestrated a daring escape from the United States Penitentiary in Pollock, Louisiana. Assigned to the prison's mailroom, McNair spent months devising his plan. He constructed a makeshift escape pod by hiding inside a pallet of mailbags, equipped with a breathing tube to ensure his survival. The pallet was shrink-wrapped and transported by forklift to a warehouse outside the prison's perimeter. Once the area was clear, McNair emerged and walked away to freedom. This was not McNair's first escape. In 1992, he escaped from the North Dakota State Penitentiary by crawling through a ventilation duct, remaining at large for 10 months before being recaptured. Following his 2006 escape, McNair managed to evade authorities for over a year, traveling across the United States and into Canada using various aliases and disguises. Shortly after his 2006 escape, McNair was stopped by police officer Carl Bordelon in Ball, Louisiana. The encounter, captured on the officer's dash cam, shows McNair calmly convincing the officer that he was merely out for a jog, despite matching the description of the escaped inmate. His composed demeanor and quick thinking allowed him to avoid immediate recapture. On October 25, 2007, McNair was finally apprehended in Campbellton, New Brunswick, Canada, after a traffic stop led to a brief foot chase. He was extradited to the United States and placed in the United States Penitentiary, Florence High, a high-security federal prison in Colorado. McNair's escapes highlighted significant security lapses and prompted reviews of prison procedures. Frank Abagnale, Jr., the Great Imposter's Daring Prison Escape. State of crime, Georgia. Age at time of escape, 23. In 1971, Frank Abagnale Jr., notorious for his audacious impersonations and frauds, executed a cunning escape from the federal detention center in Atlanta, Georgia. While being transferred into the facility by a U.S. Marshal, an oversight occurred. The Marshal failed to provide the prison with Abagnale's detention commitment papers. This administrative lapse led prison officials to believe that Abagnale was an undercover prison inspector sent by the FBI. Seizing the opportunity, Abagnale used his phone call to contact a friend, John Sebring, instructing her to forge a business card, identifying him as an FBI agent. He also had her pose as his fiancée and deliver the card to the prison, further solidifying his fabricated identity. The ruse was so convincing that the prison staff granted him privileges and eventually released him into Sebring's custody. They even provided him with a government vehicle for transportation, facilitating his escape. Following his escape, Abagnale fled to Montreal, Canada, where he planned to catch a flight to Brazil. However, his plans were thwarted when Canadian authorities, acting on a tip, apprehended him before he could leave the country. He was subsequently handed over to U.S. officials and returned to custody. Abagnale was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for multiple counts of fraud and escape. He served approximately 5 years before being released on the condition that he would assist the federal government, particularly the FBI, in identifying and apprehending other fraudsters. Abagnale's escape was so seamless and convincing that it wasn't until days later that prison officials realized they had been duped. The incident highlighted significant vulnerabilities in prison protocols, as well as Abagnale's extraordinary skills in deception and manipulation. His ability to exploit bureaucratic oversights and human trust remains one of the most remarkable aspects of his criminal career. James Robert Jones, the Army captain who vanished for decades. State of crime, South Carolina. Age at time of escape, 23.
WTVJ reports the 59-year-old man was convicted for premeditated murder and aggravated assault. He was serving a 23-year prison sentence but escaped from the maximum security prison only a few years after incarceration.
James Robert Jones, a former U.S. Army captain convicted of murder, executed a stunning escape in 1997 from the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Jones had been convicted in the brutal stabbing death of a fellow soldier's wife in 1917-4 and was serving a life sentence. However, within just 3 years, he managed to flee the high-security military prison. Using a falsified pass and taking advantage of relaxed supervision within the prison's work detail system, Jones simply walked away from the facility. It was an escape so clean and quiet that authorities didn't realize he was missing until after he was long gone. After his escape, Jones disappeared without a trace for nearly 4 decades. He assumed a new identity, Bruce Walter Keith, and settled in Florida. He lived an apparently normal suburban life, even working for years at a medical equipment company near Fort Lauderdale. Jones paid taxes, maintained a low profile, and kept out of trouble, which allowed him to avoid detection for years. He married, had children, and blended into civilian life with no known connection to his past crimes. His long disappearance made him one of the most elusive escapees in U.S. military history. In 2014, the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marshals Service reopened his case as part of a broader cold case review of military fugitives. Using fingerprint analysis and facial recognition technology, investigators tracked Jones down in Deerfield Beach, Florida. He was arrested without incident, and it was later confirmed that he had been living under an alias since the late 1970s. After his capture, he was returned to military custody and transferred back to the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth to resume his life sentence. Jones's escape remained undetected for nearly 37 years, making it one of the longest successful fugitive runs in modern military history. The fact that he lived in plain sight for decades, holding a job, paying taxes, and maintaining a seemingly normal life speaks to the ease with which some fugitives can reinvent themselves. The Texas 7, A deadly escape and nationwide manhunt. State of crime, Texas. Age at time of escape. Varied and ringleader George Rivas was 30. On December 13, 2007, inmates orchestrated a meticulously planned escape from the John B. Connolly Unit, a maximum security prison near Kennedy, Texas. The group, later dubbed the Texas Seven, included George Rivas, Michael Rodriguez, Joseph Garcia, Larry Harper, Donald Newbury, Randy Halprin, and Patrick Murphy. They overpowered civilian maintenance supervisors and prison guards, stealing their clothing, credit cards, and identification. The escapees then used a prison maintenance truck to flee the facility, leaving behind a note signed the Texas Seven. Their escape was facilitated by smuggled tools and a detailed understanding of the prison's security protocols. Following their escape, the Texas Seven embarked on a crime spree across Texas. On December 24, 2000, they robbed an Oshman sporting goods store in Irving, Texas, stealing firearms, ammunition, and cash. During the robbery, Irving police officer Aubrey Hawkins responded to a silent alarm. Upon arrival, he was ambushed and shot 11 times by the escapees, who then ran over him with their vehicle as they fled the scene. Officer Hawkins succumbed to his injuries, leaving behind a wife and young son. The escapees evaded capture for over a month, traveling across multiple states. Their run ended in January 2001, following a broadcast of America's Most Wanted that featured their story. Tips from viewers led authorities to a trailer park in Woodland Park, Colorado, where 6 of the 7 were apprehended. Larry Harper committed suicide before he could be captured. The remaining 6 were extradited to Texas, tried and convicted for their crimes. All received death sentences for the murder of Officer Hawkins. The Alcatraz escape, America's most infamous prison break. State of crime, California. Age at time of escape. Frank Morris, 35, John Anglin, 32, Clarence Anglin, 31. On the night of June 11, 1962, 3 inmates, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, executed a meticulously planned escape from Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, a maximum security prison located on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. Utilizing sharpened spoons and an improvised drill made from a vacuum cleaner motor, they widened the ventilation ducts at the back of their cells. To conceal their absence during nightly checks, they crafted dummy heads from plaster, flesh tone paint, and real human hair, placing them in their beds. The trio navigated through the utility corridors, climbed to the roof, and descended to the shoreline, where they assembled a makeshift raft constructed from over 50 raincoats. They launched into the frigid waters of the bay, aiming for the mainland. The escape was discovered the following morning, triggering an extensive manhunt by the FBI, U.S. Marshals, and local authorities. Despite exhaustive efforts, no definitive evidence of the men's fate was found. Debris believed to be from the raft and personal belongings were recovered, but the escapees themselves were never located. The FBI officially closed the case in 1979, concluding that the men likely drowned. However, the U.S. Marshals Service continues to investigate, keeping the case open. In 2013, a letter purportedly from John Anglin surfaced, claiming that all 3 men had survived the escape and lived incognito for decades. The authenticity of the letter remains unverified, but it reignited public interest in the case. Over the years, there have been numerous reported sightings and theories suggesting the men survived, but none have been conclusively proven. The 1962 Alcatraz escape remains one of the most daring and enigmatic prison breaks in American history. It has inspired books, documentaries, and films, most notably the 1979 movie Escape from Alcatraz, starring Clint Eastwood. The escape highlighted vulnerabilities in prison security and led to increased measures in correctional facilities nationwide. Alcatraz itself was closed in 1963, a year after the escape, and has since become a popular tourist destination managed by the National Park Service. The 2015 Clinton Correctional Facility escape. State of crime, New York. Age at time of escape, Richard Matt, 48, David Sweat, 34. On June 6, 2015, inmates Richard Matt and David Sweat executed a meticulously planned escape from the maximum security Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York. Both convicted murderers, they used power tools to cut through the steel walls at the back of their adjoining cells, gaining access to the prison's catwalks and utility tunnels. Navigating through a complex network of pipes and tunnels, they eventually emerged from a manhole outside the prison walls. Their escape was facilitated by Joyce Mitchell, a civilian prison employee who provided them with tools and assistance. The inmates left behind decoy dummies in their beds to delay detection. The escape triggered a massive manhunt involving over 1,500 law enforcement officers. After nearly 3 weeks on the run, Richard Matt was located and fatally shot by U.S. Border Patrol agents on June 26, 2015, in a wooded area near Malone, New York. 2 days later, David Sweat was shot and captured by a New York State trooper just 2 miles from the Canadian border. Sweat was hospitalized for his injuries and later returned to prison. The escape was reminiscent of the fictional breakout in The Shawshank Redemption, drawing widespread media attention. Investigations revealed that Joyce Mitchell had developed inappropriate relationships with both inmates and had planned to be their getaway driver, but backed out at the last moment. She was sentenced to up to 7 years in prison for her role in the escape. The 2023 Chester County Prison escape. Danilo Cavalcante's daring breakout. State of crime, Pennsylvania. Age at time of escape, 34. On August 31, 2023, Danilo Cavalcante, a 34-year-old convicted murderer, escaped from Chester County Prison in Pennsylvania. Security footage revealed that Cavalcante employed an unconventional method. He crab walked up a narrow hallway, scaling the walls to reach the roof. From there, he navigated through razor wire and made his way off the prison grounds. This escape was particularly alarming, as it was the second such incident at the facility within a short period, highlighting significant security lapses. Cavalcante's escape initiated a massive manhunt involving local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. Over the course of 2 weeks, he managed to elude capture, during which time he was spotted multiple times and even managed to steal a van and a .22 caliber rifle. The search concluded on September 13, 2023, when a tactical team located and apprehended him in a wooded area, using thermal imaging technology to aid in the capture. During his time on the run, Cavalcante managed to alter his appearance by shaving his facial hair and acquiring new clothing, making identification more challenging for authorities. His ability to survive in the wild and avoid detection for an extended period drew national attention and raised concerns about prison security protocols. The incident prompted a comprehensive review of security measures at Chester County Prison. Officials implemented immediate changes, including the installation of additional security cameras, increased staffing, and revised protocols for inmate movement. Forrest Tucker, the gentleman bandit and escape artist. State of crime, California. Age at time of escape, 59. In the summer of 1979, Forrest Silva Tucker, a seasoned bank robber and escape artist, orchestrated a daring escape from San Quentin State Prison in California. Along with 2 accomplices, Tucker constructed a makeshift kayak within the prison walls. Utilizing this homemade vessel, they paddled away from the prison, which is situated on the shores of San Francisco Bay, right under the watchful eyes of the guards. This escape was one of Tucker's most audacious, showcasing his ingenuity and determination. Following the escape, Tucker evaded capture for 4 years. During this period, he led a gang known as the Over the Hill Gang, comprising elderly criminals who committed a series of bank robberies across the United States. Their operations were marked by meticulous planning and a non-violent approach, which often involved charming interactions with bank staff. Tucker's ability to blend in and his courteous demeanor made it challenging for authorities to apprehend him. Tucker claimed to have escaped from prison successfully 18 times and unsuccessfully 12 times, earning him a reputation as one of America's most prolific escape artists. His life and escapades were so captivating that they inspired the 2018 film The Old Man and the Gun, starring Robert Redford. The movie portrays Tucker's final years, during which he continued his criminal activities well into his late 70s, embodying a blend of charm and audacity that defined his criminal career. Forrest Tucker's life story shows just how paradoxical people can be, blending crime, charm, and a relentless drive to reinvent himself at every turn. Despite numerous incarcerations, he remained undeterred, continually seeking freedom and engaging in criminal enterprises. His exploits have been documented in various articles and books, offering insights into the mind of a man who defied the odds and the law repeatedly. Tucker passed away in 2004 while serving a 13-year sentence at the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, Texas, leaving behind a legacy that continues to intrigue and perplex. Casey White prison escape. State of crime: Alabama. Age at time of escape: 38 years old. The 2022 escape of Casey White from an Alabama jail, aided by corrections officer Vicky White, captivated the nation with its blend of romance, betrayal, and tragedy. On April 29, 2022, Vicky, then the Assistant Director of Corrections at Lauderdale County Jail, escorted Casey, a 38-year-old inmate awaiting trial for capital murder, out of the facility under the pretense of a mental health evaluation. This act marked the beginning of an 11-day manhunt that ended with Vicky's death and Casey's recapture. Investigations revealed that Vicky and Casey had developed a romantic relationship during his incarceration. Prior to the escape, Vicky sold her home at a loss, purchased firearms, and acquired a getaway vehicle. Their plan involved multiple vehicles in a series of motels as they fled northward. On May 9, 2022, authorities located the pair in Evansville, Indiana. A brief car chase ensued, culminating in a crash. As law enforcement approached, Vicky shot herself and later died from her injuries, while Casey surrendered without resistance. Following his capture, Casey was charged with first-degree escape and felony murder under Alabama's felony murder rule, which allows for a murder charge if a death occurs during the commission of a felony. However, in May 2023, he pleaded guilty to the escape charge, and the felony murder charge was dropped as part of a plea agreement. He received a life sentence for the escape, adding to his existing 75-year sentence for previous crimes. The case garnered widespread media attention and has been the subject of documentaries and dramatizations, including the Netflix documentary Jailbreak: Love on the Run. The story shows how easily things can go wrong when the lines between inmates and staff start to blur, and just how much damage that kind of manipulation can cause both in and outside the prison walls. Gonzalo Lopez, Texas prison escape and tragic aftermath. State of crime: Texas. Age at time of escape: 46. On May 12, 2022, Gonzalo Lopez, a convicted murderer affiliated with the Mexican Mafia, escaped from a Texas Department of Criminal Justice TDCJ transport bus near Centerville, Texas. While being transported for a medical appointment, Lopez managed to free himself from his restraints and used a sharp object to cut through a metal door, separating the inmates from the driver. He then crawled into the driver's compartment, stabbed the driver, and engaged in a struggle with another officer. Lopez briefly took control of the bus, but crashed it a short distance away and fled into the surrounding woods, initiating a massive manhunt. For 3 weeks, Lopez evaded capture, despite an extensive search involving hundreds of law enforcement officers. On June 2, 2022, he broke into a ranch in Centerville, Texas, and murdered 66-year-old Mark Collins and his 4 grandchildren, Waylon, 18, Carson, 16, Hudson, 11, and Bryson, 11. After the killings, Lopez stole firearms and a pickup truck from the property. Later that day, authorities spotted the stolen truck in Atascosa County, approximately 220 miles from the crime scene. After a brief pursuit, officers deployed spike strips to disable the vehicle. Lopez crashed the truck, exited, and opened fire on the officers with an AR-15 rifle. Law enforcement returned fire, killing Lopez at the scene. The escape and subsequent murders prompted the TDCJ to suspend inmate transports and conduct a comprehensive review of its procedures. Investigations revealed multiple security lapses that facilitated Lopez's escape. Darnell Keith Washington, a violent escape and crime spree across California. State of crime: California. Age at time of escape: 23. On August 28, 2012, Darnell Keith Washington escaped from the Glen Helen Rehabilitation Center in San Bernardino County, California, where he was awaiting trial for armed robbery. His wife, Tanya Washington, assisted in the escape by helping him scale a 10-foot fence during a visitation. After the escape, the couple embarked on a month-long crime spree across California. On September 2, during a traffic stop in South El Monte, Darnell shot and wounded Los Angeles County Sheriff's Deputy John Marquez. The couple then carjacked a vehicle and continued their criminal activities, including robberies and additional carjackings. Their spree culminated on October 5th with the murder of 55-year-old retired schoolteacher Susie Coe in Hercules, California. Darnell stabbed Coe 21 times before stealing her car. The couple was apprehended later that day in SeaTac, Washington, after a brief chase. Following their arrest, both Darnell and Tanya Washington faced multiple charges, including murder, attempted murder, robbery, and carjacking. In December 2012, they pleaded not guilty to all charges. While awaiting trial, Darnell attempted another escape by carving out his cell window and fashioning a rope from bed sheets, but the attempt was unsuccessful. In August 2016, Darnell Washington's trial commenced. Tanya Washington accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter and receiving a sentence of 23 years and 4 months in prison. She agreed to testify against her husband. The defense argued that Tanya was responsible for Coe's murder, but DNA evidence on the murder weapon linked Darnell to the crime. In September 2016, Darnell was found guilty of first-degree murder, and in November 2016, he was sentenced to death. Darnell Washington's escape and subsequent crime spree uncovered significant security lapses within the correctional system. Frank Freshwater's The Shawshank Fugitive. State of crime: Ohio. Age at time of escape: 23. In 1957, Frank Freshwaters was convicted of voluntary manslaughter after fatally striking Eugene Flint with his car while speeding in Akron, Ohio. Initially sentenced to 1 to 20 years, his term was suspended and he was placed on probation. However, after violating probation, he was incarcerated at the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield. Due to good behavior, he was transferred to the Sandusky Honor Farm, a minimum security facility. On September 30, 1959, Freshwaters escaped from the Honor Farm. The specifics of his escape remain undisclosed. Following his escape, Freshwaters adopted the alias William Harold Cox and led a quiet life, working as a truck driver and mobile librarian. He initially moved to Florida, obtaining a Social Security card under his assumed name. Later, he settled in Hurricane, West Virginia. In 1917-5, he was arrested in Charleston, West Virginia, but then Governor Arch A. Moore Jr. refused to extradite him to Ohio, citing his positive reputation in the community. Freshwaters was released and continued to live under the radar. In 2015, the U.S. Marshal Service reopened his case and tracked him to Melbourne, Florida. On May 4, 2015, authorities approached Freshwaters, who initially denied his identity but soon confessed. He was arrested without incident, marking the end of a 56-year fugitive run, the longest in U.S. Marshals history. Extradited to Ohio, he served time until the Ohio Adult Parole Authority voted for his release in February 2016, citing his nonviolent history during his time on the run. He was released on parole on June 15, 2016. Monroe Hickson, serial killer and fugitive. State of crime: South Carolina. Age at time of escape: 57. Monroe Hickson, born on July 8, 1908, in Aiken County, South Carolina, was a convicted serial killer responsible for 4 murders and an attempted murder in 1946. His crimes included the axe murder of David Garrett, the fatal shooting of Mary Bennett and the wounding of her husband Edward, the bludgeoning death of Annie Weisberg, and an assault on a female liquor store clerk who survived. Initially, these crimes went unsolved, and another man, L.D. Harris, was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death for 2 of the murders. Hickson's involvement came to light in 1957 when he was arrested for assault and subsequently confessed to the earlier murders. He was convicted and sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms. While serving his sentence at Manning Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina, Hickson escaped custody on March 10, 1966. He managed to walk away from the prison's outside yard without the guards noticing. After his escape, a federal warrant was issued, and he was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list on February 17, 1967. Hickson remained at large until December 29, 1967, when he died in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Living under the alias Willie Tyler, he had been working as a migrant farm worker. His identity was confirmed through fingerprint analysis after a couple recognized him and reported their suspicions to authorities. Monroe Hickson's case is notable for the wrongful conviction of L.D. Harris, who was exonerated after Hickson's confession. James Earl Ray, assassin of Martin Luther King Jr., state of crime: Tennessee. Age at time of escape: 50. James Earl Ray was convicted for the assassination of civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. King was fatally shot on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, and Ray was arrested 2 months later at London Heathrow Airport while traveling under a false identity. Ray pleaded guilty in 1969 and was sentenced to 99 years in prison to avoid the death penalty. He later recanted his confession, claiming he was part of a larger conspiracy. On June 10, 1977, while incarcerated at Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in Tennessee, James Earl Ray escaped with 6 other inmates. They sawed through bars and used a makeshift ladder to climb over the prison wall. Ray was on the run for 55 hours before being captured in rugged terrain near the prison by a massive manhunt that included helicopters and bloodhounds. Ray's escape led to an additional year being added to his sentence, bringing his total to 100 years. Over the years, he filed multiple unsuccessful appeals seeking a retrial, maintaining he was framed. James Earl Ray died in prison on April 23, 1998, at the age of 70 from complications related to liver failure and hepatitis C. Ray's escape and controversial conviction remain part of American history's darker chapters. Many still debate whether he acted alone or was part of a broader conspiracy. The King family, in fact, supported a retrial, suggesting Ray may not have been the real assassin. Ted Bundy, the infamous serial killer who escaped twice. State of crime: Colorado. First escape: Florida. Final arrest. Age at time of escape: 30, first escape; 31, second escape. Ted Bundy, one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, was responsible for the deaths of at least 30 young women during the 1970s, although the actual number of victims may be much higher. Arrested in 1975 and facing murder charges in Colorado, Bundy became notorious not only for his brutal crimes, but also for his audacious prison escapes. With a background in law and a manipulative charm, he was able to exploit weaknesses in the justice system to evade capture twice in a single year. His first escape occurred on June 7, 1977, at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Colorado. While granted unsupervised access to the law library to prepare for his trial, Bundy jumped from a second-story window and disappeared into the wilderness. Despite the rugged terrain and ongoing search efforts, he remained on the run for 6 days before being recaptured while driving a stolen vehicle. This escape shocked authorities and highlighted serious lapses in security. Later that year, on December 30, 1977, Bundy escaped again, and this time from the Garfield County Jail. He had lost significant weight and used a hacksaw to widen a ceiling panel in his cell. Bundy crawled through the ductwork, dropped into the jailer's apartment, and walked out unnoticed. He made his way across several states, eventually arriving in Florida, where he resumed his killing spree. Within weeks, he brutally murdered multiple women, including 2 students at Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority and 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Bundy was finally apprehended in Pensacola, Florida, in February 1978. He was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. After nearly a decade of appeals and interviews during which he confessed to additional crimes, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair on January 24, 1989, at Florida State Prison. His story remains one of the most chilling examples of criminal cunning and systemic failure in U.S. criminal justice history. Edward Dean Kennedy. State of crime: Florida. Age at time of escape: 33. Edward Dean Kennedy, a convicted murderer, shocked the state of Florida when he escaped from prison in 1981. Kennedy had already been sentenced to life for a 1978 double murder involving the fatal shooting of 2 men. While incarcerated at the Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida, he managed to escape with another inmate by cutting through a perimeter fence, a breach that exposed serious flaws in prison security measures at the time. Once on the run, Kennedy's behavior turned increasingly violent. Just days after the escape, he abducted and murdered a man named Floyd Cohn, using the victim's car to continue his flight from law enforcement. The killing added a new murder charge to Kennedy's record and prompted a multi-state manhunt that stretched across the southeastern United States. The FBI and local agencies warned the public that Kennedy was extremely dangerous and possibly armed. Kennedy was eventually apprehended after a tense standoff in Texas. The violent nature of his escape and the subsequent murder drew national attention and served as a catalyst for tightening security protocols in Florida's correctional facilities. His actions led to his resentencing, and this time with the death penalty on the table due to the killing committed during his escape from custody. Edward Dean Kennedy was executed in Florida's electric chair on July 21, 1992. His case remains one of the most lethal prison escape incidents in U.S. history, highlighting how lapses in prison infrastructure can lead to further tragedy when violent offenders regain freedom. His name is now etched among those whose escapes reshaped how prisons approach high-risk inmates. Briley Brothers, State of crime: Virginia. Age at time of escape: 28 and 30. The Briley brothers, Linwood and James Briley, were part of a notorious crime spree in Richmond, Virginia, during the late 1970s that left at least 11 people dead. The 2 brothers, along with their younger sibling Anthony and an accomplice, committed a series of brutal and sadistic murders, often targeting victims at random. Linwood and James were eventually convicted of multiple counts of capital murder and sentenced to death in 1980. They were housed at Virginia's death row facility in Mecklenburg Correctional Center, a maximum security prison. Despite the high security setting, Linwood, 30, and James, 28, managed to escape death row on May 31, 1984. With the help of 5 other inmates, they meticulously planned their breakout, exploiting lax oversight and smuggling tools over time. The escapees took advantage of a prison work detail to overpower guards, using fabricated weapons and disguises. They successfully broke out of the facility by scaling a prison fence in a laundry truck, triggering a nationwide manhunt. Following their escape, The Briley brothers made their way north to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where they sought refuge with family members. For nearly 3 weeks, the two managed to avoid detection, hiding out and blending in while law enforcement scoured the East Coast. However, a tip from someone familiar with their case eventually led to their capture on June 19, 1984, ending one of the most dangerous prison breaks in U.S. history. Linwood Briley was executed by electric chair on October 12, 1984, and James Briley followed on April 18, 1985. Their escape remains one of the most infamous in Virginia's correctional history, due to their violent background and the deadly potential they posed while on the run. The case prompted a complete overhaul of security measures at Mecklenburg Correctional Center and led to greater scrutiny of death row protocols across the country. Martin Gurula, the first death row escapee in Texas in over 60 years. State of crime, Texas. Age at time of escape, 29. Martin Gurula was a convicted murderer on Texas death row when he made headlines in 1998 by becoming the first inmate in over 6 decades to escape from death row in the state. Gurula had been sentenced to death in 1993 for the 1992 murder of a Corpus Christi man during a robbery. At the time of his escape from the Ellis unit near Huntsville, Texas, Gurula was 29 years old. His daring prison break exposed major lapses in security within a supposedly impenetrable part of the Texas prison system. On the night of November 27, 1998, Gurula and 6 other death row inmates cut through a recreation yard fence and scaled 2 prison walls. While the others were quickly caught or retreated back into the prison, Gurula successfully escaped. He vanished into the surrounding wooded area, sparking a massive manhunt that involved helicopters, dogs, and hundreds of law enforcement officers. His flight from justice lasted several days, capturing national attention and raising fears over the vulnerability of even the most secure prison units. Despite the extensive search, Gurula managed to avoid immediate capture. However, on December 3, 1998, authorities discovered his body in the Trinity River near the prison. An autopsy revealed that Gurula had drowned while attempting to cross the river shortly after his escape. His brief time on the run ended tragically, but the implications of his breakout led to sweeping changes in how death row inmates were secured and supervised in Texas. Martin Gurula's escape remains a pivotal moment in the history of Texas corrections. Not only did it reveal the ingenuity of desperate inmates, but it also exposed critical flaws in death row containment that had gone unnoticed for years. The incident prompted a complete security overhaul at the Ellis unit and served as a cautionary tale for correctional institutions across the U.S. Leslie Dale Martin, state of crime, Louisiana, age at time of escape, 34. Leslie Dale Martin was convicted of the brutal 1991 assault and murder of 19-year-old Christina Bergen in Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana. After meeting her at a bar, Martin offered to give her a ride home, but instead drove to a remote area where he assaulted, strangled, and ultimately killed her. He then attempted to cover up the crime by burning her body and disposing of the remains in a wooded area. His actions were especially heinous, and the evidence against him, along with his confession, resulted in a conviction for first-degree murder. In July 2001, while on death row at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, which is also known as Angola Prison, Martin and 3 other death row inmates plotted an escape. They meticulously sawed through the bars of their cell doors and used dummy heads to make it appear they were sleeping. However, before they could fully execute their plan, prison staff discovered the attempted escape and quickly intervened. The escape was foiled before the inmates could leave the prison grounds. Following the failed escape, security measures at Angola were significantly increased. Martin's already grim legal outlook worsened due to the incident. He was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 2002, at the age of 35. His case remains one of Louisiana's more chilling examples of both violent crime and the extreme lengths some inmates will go to in order to avoid justice. Sarah Jo Pender, State of crime, Indiana. Age at time of escape, 29. Sarah Jo Pender, convicted of orchestrating the 2000 double murder of her 2 roommates, managed to escape from the Rockville Correctional Facility in Indiana on August 4, 2008. With the help of prison guard Scott Spittler and a former inmate named Jamie Long, Pender slipped past security. Spittler smuggled in civilian clothes, and Long, who was on work release, helped transport Pender out of the facility in a prison van. The escape was carefully coordinated, exposing serious lapses in prison oversight and staff integrity. Pender remained a fugitive for 136 days. During that time, she relocated to Chicago, changed her appearance, and began a new life under a false identity. She worked as a nanny and attempted to keep a low profile. However, her case gained widespread media attention after being featured on America's Most Wanted. A viewer tip led U.S. Marshals to her hideout, and she was arrested without incident on December 22, 2008. Following her capture, Pender was returned to Indiana and placed under maximum security conditions. Guard Scott Spittler was sentenced to 8 years in prison for his role in the escape, and accomplice Jamie Long also faced charges. Pender's already lengthy 110-year sentence was extended due to the escape, and she was transferred to a more secure facility to prevent further incidents. Despite being labeled a female Charles Manson by prosecutors, Sarah Jo Pender maintained a calm and charismatic public image, even attracting public sympathy. Her case continues to be one of the most notorious female prison escapes in U.S. history. From cunning plots to daring breakouts, these escapes remind us that even the most secure prisons can't always contain the determination of those inside. But justice has a long memory, and eventually the law catches up. These fugitives may have slipped through the cracks for a time, but none could outrun their fate. Thanks for joining us on this gripping journey through America's most shocking prison escapes. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that uncover the darkest corners of justice.